November 17th, 1928. A black man walks through the front doors of Chicago's Lexington Hotel past armed guards, through marble hallways, into the private dining room of the most dangerous white man in America. In segregated America, this moment shouldn't exist. But Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, isn't here by accident. He's here because someone decided his life was worth risking for a conversation that could rewrite the rules of the underworld. The Lexington isn't just a hotel, it's a fortress, Al Capone's headquarters, the nerve center of a $100 million bootlegging empire. Men have been killed for less than looking at this building the wrong way. Yet here stands Johnson, 23 years old, Harlem-born, unarmed, surrounded by Capone's enforcers. Their hands rest on concealed weapons. Their eyes track every breath he takes. One wrong word, one perceived threat, and he's dead before he hits the floor. But if he says the right words, if this meeting goes the way he's planned, he walks out of here with something no black gangster in America has ever secured: a deal with Al Capone. Not submission, not surrender. A partnership. The stakes couldn't be higher. This isn't just about money, it's about survival. It's about whether black organized crime can exist on its own terms, or whether it gets swallowed whole by white mobs who've been circling Harlem like sharks for years. Bumpy Johnson carries the weight of an entire community into that room. Madam Queen sent him. Harlem's numbers runners are counting on him. And Capone? Capone's waiting to see if this young man from uptown has the guts to propose the impossible. What happens next will stay secret for decades. No newspapers will cover it. No police reports will mention it. But the deal struck in that room will govern American organized crime for nearly 40 years, hidden in plain sight, protected by silence, and enforced by fear. Before we go any further, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button because this story gets darker, stranger, and more unbelievable with every minute. This is the story of the meeting that should never have happened, the alliance that history forgot, and the two gangsters who understood that, sometimes, breaking every rule is the only way to win. To understand why Al Capone would even consider sitting down with Bumpy Johnson, you need to understand the empire he'd built and the cracks starting to show. By 1928, Alphonse Gabriel Capone wasn't just a gangster, he was an institution. At 29 years old, he controlled Chicago like a king controlled a kingdom. Bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, protection rackets. If money moved through the city, Capone took his cut. Estimates put his annual income at over $100 million. That's roughly $1.7 billion in today's money. He owned cops, judges, politicians. He threw lavish parties. He wore custom suits. He smiled for cameras. And when someone crossed him, they disappeared. The previous February had proven just how untouchable he'd become. The Street Valentine's Day massacre, 7 men from Bugs Moran's North Side gang lined up against a garage wall and executed in broad daylight. Capone wasn't even in Chicago when it happened. He was in Florida, establishing an alibi while his men did the work. The message was clear. Challenge Capone, and you don't just lose. You get erased. But here's the thing about being untouchable: it makes you a target. By late 1928, Capone faced problems that couldn't be solved with a Tommy gun. The federal government was closing in. Not for murder, not for bootlegging, for taxes. The IRS had started building a case that would eventually send him to Alcatraz. Every flashy purchase, every public appearance, every dollar he flaunted made their job easier. He needed to be smarter, quieter, more strategic. And then there was Harlem. New York's black neighborhoods had developed the most profitable gambling operation in the country, the numbers racket. It was simple, brilliant, and impossible to stop. Every day, thousands of people placed small bets on a 3-digit number. The payout was 600 to 1. The odds were 1,000 to 1. The house always won. And in Harlem, the house was run by black gangsters who answered to no one. Capone wanted in. His associates in New York wanted in. White mobs across the East Coast wanted in. But every attempt to muscle into Harlem's numbers game had failed. Not because black operators were more violent, they weren't, but because they were more organized, more embedded in their communities, and more willing to fight a war of attrition that would cost everyone money. Turf wars were expensive. They attracted police attention. They disrupted business. And worst of all, they were unpredictable. Capone had built his empire on control. Harlem represented chaos he couldn't contain. So when word reached him that Harlem's operators wanted to talk, not beg, not surrender, but negotiate, Capone did something unusual. He listened, because the smartest gangsters don't just know how to fight, they know when not to. While Al Capone ruled Chicago with bullets and bribes, a woman in Harlem had built something even more powerful, an empire that didn't need his permission to exist. Her name was Stephanie Street Claire. But on the streets, they called her Madame Queen. She was French Caribbean, fiercely intelligent, and absolutely ruthless when she needed to be. She'd arrived in Harlem during the Great Migration, when Black Americans were flooding north, looking for opportunity. What she found was a neighborhood bursting with energy, culture, and money, but no one protecting it from white gangsters who saw Black communities as easy prey. Street Claire changed that. She didn't invent the numbers racket, but she perfected it. Every morning, Harlem woke up and placed bets. Factory workers, maids, porters, shopkeepers, everyone played the numbers. A nickel here, a dime there. It didn't sound like much until you added it up. Thousands of bets, every single day. The money flowed like a river, and Madame Queen controlled the current. But her genius wasn't just in collecting bets. It was in building a system that white mobs couldn't crack. She hired locally, paid fairly, settled disputes quickly, protected her runners from police and rival gangs. She reinvested profits back into Harlem, funding businesses, supporting families, becoming a pillar of the community. People didn't just work for her, they believed in her, and that loyalty created a firewall no outsider could penetrate. When Dutch Schultz's crew tried to move in, they found themselves fighting not just Street Claire's enforcers, but the entire neighborhood. Informants went silent, witnesses disappeared, runners refused to switch sides no matter how much money was offered. White gangsters were used to buying loyalty. In Harlem, loyalty wasn't for sale. Street Claire understood something that Capone's associates didn't. In a segregated America, Black neighborhoods operated by different rules. White cops didn't patrol them the same way. White criminals didn't understand the culture, and white mobs couldn't just roll in and take over without starting a war that would cost more than it was worth. But Street Claire also understood the limits of her power. She could defend Harlem. She couldn't stop every white mob in America from trying. Sooner or later, someone with Capone's resources would make a serious play. And when that happened, she needed to be ready, not just to fight, but to negotiate from a position of strength. That's where Bumpy Johnson came in. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson had been her enforcer, her strategist, her most trusted lieutenant. He was younger than her, but he thought like her. Calculated, patient, willing to use violence when necessary, but smart enough to avoid it when possible. He'd earned his nickname Bumpy from a childhood injury that left a permanent mark on his skull. But the name fit for another reason. He was a problem, the kind of problem that made other gangsters think twice. Quick question, what time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story, smash that like button. Trust me, this gets even crazier. When Street Claire decided it was time to approach Capone, she didn't send a messenger. She sent Bumpy. Because this wasn't a surrender. It was a negotiation between equals, and Capone needed to understand that from the moment Bumpy walked through his door. Bumpy Johnson wasn't supposed to survive past 30. Most men in his line of work didn't. He was born in South Carolina in 1905, but the South had no future for a black man who refused to bow his head. So, like thousands of others, he migrated north to Harlem in his teens, looking for opportunity, freedom, and a chance to be something more than what Jim Crow would allow. What he found was a neighborhood alive with possibility and danger in equal measure. Harlem, in the 1,920 seconds, was jazz clubs and speakeasies, poets and preachers, dreamers and hustlers. It was also a battlefield. White gangs wanted control, black operators wanted independence, and young men like Bumpy had to choose a side. He chose Madame Queen, not because she paid the most, though she paid well. Not because she was the most violent, she wasn't. He chose her because she was building something that could last. She wasn't just running numbers. She was creating infrastructure. A system. A model that could survive, even if she didn't. Bumpy became her enforcer, but he was never just muscle. He studied people, read situations, knew when to escalate, and when to de-escalate. He understood that in organized crime, Reputation was currency. If people feared you, you didn't have to fight as often. If people respected you, you didn't have to prove yourself as much. Bumpy had both. By 1928, he'd built a name that carried weight far beyond Harlem. Other boroughs knew him. New Jersey knew him. And when Madame Queen started planning her approach to Capone, there was only one person she trusted to deliver the message. But sending Bumpy to Chicago wasn't just strategic. It was a test. If Capone refused to meet, Bumpy would know before he ever reached the Lexington Hotel. He'd be turned away at the door, or worse, he'd never make it to the door at all. If Capone agreed to meet but planned to humiliate him, Bumpy would read it in the room. The seating, the tone, the number of armed men present. And if Capone planned to kill him, well, Bumpy knew that was a possibility too. He went anyway. The train ride from New York to Chicago took nearly a full day. Plenty of time to think, plenty of time to second guess. Bumpy carried no weapon. Showing up armed to Capone's headquarters would be suicide. He carried no backup. This meeting was too sensitive for an entourage. All he had was the proposal, his reputation, and his ability to read the room. He knew what failure looked like. If this deal fell apart, Harlem would face an all-out assault from every white mob on the East Coast. Street Claire's empire would crumble. The numbers racket would be taken over, stripped for parts, and handed to men who saw black neighborhoods as nothing more than profit centers to exploit. But if he succeeded, if he walked out of that room with Capone's word, then Harlem would have something no black community in America had ever secured: autonomy, protection, a seat at the table. When Bumpy Johnson stepped off that train in Chicago, he wasn't just representing Madam Queen. He was representing every black operator who'd ever been told they couldn't build something that mattered. Every runner who'd been beaten by cops, every neighborhood that had been carved up by outsiders who didn't live there, didn't care about the people, and only saw dollar signs. He walked into the Lexington Hotel knowing that history would be written in that room. The only question was whether he'd live long enough to see it. The room was smaller than Bumpy expected, not the grand ballroom or sprawling conference space you'd imagine for a meeting of this magnitude. Just a private dining room on one of the upper floors of the Lexington Hotel. Thick curtains, heavy wooden table, chairs positioned deliberately, and men, Capone's men, stationed at every exit. Al Capone sat at the head of the table. He didn't stand when Bumpy entered, didn't extend a hand, just watched, studied, sized him up the way a predator sizes up prey. Bumpy had expected that. What he hadn't expected was the silence. No pleasantries, no small talk. Capone wasn't interested in making him comfortable. This was a power play, a reminder that Bumpy was in his house, on his turf, surrounded by men who'd killed for far less than a perceived insult. So Bumpy did the only thing that made sense. He sat down, not at the far end of the table like a subordinate, not standing like a servant waiting for permission. He pulled out a chair, sat across from Capone, and met his eyes. Equal to equal. The tension in the room shifted. Capone's men tensed. Hands moved closer to weapons. But Capone himself? He smiled, just slightly, because Bumpy had just passed the first test. "You've got guts walking in here," Capone said. His voice was calm, almost friendly. But there was an edge underneath. "So, let's not waste time. What does Harlem want?" Bumpy didn't flinch. "Harlem wants what you want. Money, peace, and a system that works for everyone." "Everyone?" Capone leaned back in his chair. "That's a nice word. But we both know how this business works. There's no everyone. There's who's in charge, and who pays tribute. That's one way to run things," Bumpy said. "But it's expensive. You've been trying to take Harlem's numbers game for 2 years now. How much has it cost you? How many men? How much heat from the cops? How much money lost because your people are fighting instead of earning?" Capone's expression didn't change, but Bumpy saw the flicker. He'd hit a nerve. "We're not asking you to stay out of Harlem," Bumpy continued. "We're offering you a cut, a steady cut. No war, no risk, just profit." "And what do you get?" Capone asked. "Autonomy. We run our neighborhoods. You don't interfere. We pay you a percentage. Call it a tax, call it tribute, call it whatever you want. But we control the operation. We handle enforcement. We manage the runners. You collect, and you leave us alone." One of Capone's men laughed. Not loud, but loud enough. "You think you can just walk in here and dictate terms?" Bumpy didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Capone. Because Capone was the only one in the room who mattered. "I'm not dictating," Bumpy said. "I'm proposing. There's a difference." Capone tilted his head. "And if I say no? If I decide to take Harlem by force?" "You could try," Bumpy said. "But you're smarter than that. You didn't build this empire by fighting wars you don't need to fight. You built it by making deals that benefit you more than they cost you." Silence. Capone studied him, not with anger, with curiosity. Because Bumpy wasn't begging. He wasn't threatening. He was offering a business solution to a business problem. "You know what I think?" Capone said finally. "I think you're right. War is expensive, and Harlem's not worth the headache if I can make money without the fight." Bumpy felt the shift in the room. Not relief, not yet, but possibility. "But here's the thing," Capone continued. "If I make this deal, every other neighborhood's gonna want the same thing. Every crew in every city's gonna think they can negotiate with me, and that's a problem. Not if the deal stays quiet," Bumpy said. "No announcements, no public agreements, just an understanding between us. You get paid, we stay independent, and nobody outside this room ever knows." Capone leaned forward. "And how do I know you'll keep paying? How do I know Harlem won't stop sending tribute the second I turn my back?" "Because we're not stupid," Bumpy said. "We know what happens if we break our word, and we know that keeping you happy is cheaper than fighting you." Another silence. Longer this time. Then Capone smiled. A real smile. Not friendly, exactly, but respectful. "You've got a deal," he said. "But understand this. If Harlem ever stops paying, if your people ever try to expand outside your territory, if I hear even a whisper that you're playing me, this conversation never happened, and neither did you." Bumpy nodded. "Understood." "Good." Capone stood, extended his hand. Bumpy stood and shook it. Firm, brief, the kind of handshake that seals a contract written in blood and silence. If you're still watching, do me a favor, hit that share button. This story deserves to be heard, and drop a comment telling me what's the weather like where you are. Seriously, I'm curious. As Bumpy walked out of the Lexington Hotel that day, past the same armed guards who'd watched him enter, he carried something no black gangster in America had ever possessed. A treaty with the most powerful white crime boss in the country. It wasn't equality, it wasn't justice, but it was survival. And in 1928, survival was victory. What neither man knew, what no one in that room could have predicted, was that the deal they'd just made would outlast them both. It would shape organized crime for decades. It would create a blueprint that other cities would follow. And it would remain one of the best-kept secrets in American criminal history, because the most dangerous deals are the ones nobody knows exist. The deal was made. But making a deal and enforcing it are two very different things. Bumpy Johnson returned to Harlem with something more valuable than money. He brought back legitimacy. Not the kind recognized by law, but the kind that mattered in the underworld. Capone had given his word, and in organized crime, a man's word was the only contract that held weight. Madam Queen received the news exactly as you'd expect, calm, calculated, and already planning 3 steps ahead. She knew this agreement wouldn't hold itself together through goodwill. It would require discipline, structure, and the kind of enforcement that made breaking the deal more costly than keeping it. So she did what any smart operator would do. She tightened her operation. Runners were vetted more carefully. Money was counted twice. Payments to Capone's organization were never late, never short, and always delivered through trusted intermediaries. There was no room for error. One missed payment, one act of disrespect, and the entire arrangement could collapse. But here's what made the deal work. It wasn't one-sided. Capone kept his end of the bargain too. White mobs that had been circling Harlem suddenly backed off, not because they wanted to, because Capone told them to. Dutch Schultz, who'd been making aggressive moves into black neighborhoods, found himself facing pressure from his own associates. The message was clear. Harlem was off limits. Anyone who violated that understanding would answer to Capone. And just like that, the violence stopped. Not completely, this was still organized crime. But the large-scale turf wars, the coordinated assaults, the attempts to dismantle Harlem's numbers operation, they evaporated. For the first time in years, black operators could focus on business instead of survival. The profits soared. With peace came efficiency. Runners didn't have to worry about being ambushed. Money didn't have to be spent on armed guards and retaliation. Street, Claire's operation expanded, not through violence, but through reliability. People trusted the system, and trust, in the numbers game, was everything. Capone's cut flowed in steadily, not enough to make him dependent on Harlem, but enough to prove the model worked. He was making money without lifting a finger, without risking his men, without attracting federal attention. It was the kind of deal every gangster dreams of: passive income, with no overhead. But the real genius of the arrangement wasn't the money. It was the silence. Nobody talked about it. Not in the press, not in police reports, not even in the gossip that usually spread through the underworld like wildfire. Both sides understood that the deal's power came from its invisibility. The moment it became public knowledge, it would invite scrutiny, jealousy, and interference, so it stayed buried. Capone's men didn't brag about the Harlem tribute. Street Claire's operators didn't boast about their autonomy. And Bumpy Johnson, he became known as a fixer, a strategist, a man who could navigate between worlds that weren't supposed to touch. His reputation grew, but the source of that reputation remained vague. People knew he was connected. They just didn't know how deep those connections ran. The blueprint spread quietly. Other cities noticed. Not the details, those were locked tight, but they noticed the results. Harlem was stable, profitable, protected, and slowly, carefully, similar arrangements began forming in Detroit, Philadelphia, and parts of New Jersey. Black operators and white mobs finding ways to coexist, not out of friendship, but out of mutual benefit. It wasn't integration, it was segregation, with a profit motive. Each side stayed in their lane, respected boundaries, and made money. The system worked because it didn't challenge the social order, it exploited it, and then Capone fell. In 1931, just 3 years after the meeting with Bumpy, federal agents finally got their man. Not for murder, not for bootlegging, for tax evasion. Capone was sentenced to 11 years and sent to Alcatraz. The empire he'd built began to fracture. Associates fought for control. Territories shifted. Alliances crumbled. But the deal with Harlem? It survived. Because it wasn't built on Capone's personality. It was built on a structure that benefited whoever was in charge. The new bosses in Chicago saw the same thing Capone had seen: Harlem was more valuable as a partner than as a conquest. So the payments continued. The boundaries held. And the silence remained unbroken. Bumpy Johnson's star continued to rise. By the 1,930 he was one of the most powerful black gangsters in America. He worked with the Italian mobs when it suited him. He protected Harlem when it didn't. And he never forgot the lesson he'd learned in that room at the Lexington Hotel. Power isn't just about what you can take. It's about what you can negotiate. Madam Queen eventually stepped back from the day-to-day operations, but her influence never faded. She'd built something that outlasted her. A system, a model, a proof of concept that black organized crime could exist on its own terms. The deal held for nearly 40 years. Through Prohibition's end, through World War II, through the rise of the Five Families and the formation of the Commission, it adapted, evolved, and endured, hidden in plain sight, protected by the same segregation that was supposed to keep black operators powerless. And history? History barely noticed, because the story didn't fit the narrative. It was too complicated, too uncomfortable. It showed cooperation where there was supposed to be only oppression. It revealed pragmatism where there was supposed to be only hatred. So it got buried not by conspiracy, but by indifference. The deal that changed American organized crime became a footnote, a rumor, a story told in whispers by old-timers who remembered when things worked differently. But it happened, and it mattered. Most people think organized crime in America was always a white man's game. The Italian mobs, the Irish gangs, the Jewish syndicates. That's the story Hollywood tells. That's the version that made it into history books. But the truth is messier and far more interesting. The deal struck between Capone and Bumpy Johnson in 1928 didn't just create peace in Harlem. It created a template, a model that proved black and white gangsters could operate in parallel, not as equals in society, but as equals in profit. And that model quietly reshaped the American underworld for generations. By the 1,930 the concept had spread beyond Harlem. Detroit's black numbers operators reached similar understandings with the Purple Gang. In Philadelphia, black policy bankers negotiated territorial agreements with Italian crews. In Newark, the same pattern emerged. Different cities, different players, same basic structure. It wasn't a revolution. It was evolution. Organized crime, adapting to the reality that some neighborhoods were more profitable when left alone, that some operations ran smoother when managed by people who actually lived there, that forcing control over every territory wasn't just expensive, it was inefficient, and when the commission was formed in the 1930 seconds, the governing body that brought together the major Italian crime families, this model of territorial respect was already baked in. Not officially, not in any written agreement, but in practice, the commission recognized that certain neighborhoods operated under different rules. Harlem, the south side of Chicago, North Philadelphia. These weren't contested territories. They were understood. Bumpy Johnson became the living embodiment of that understanding. By the 1940 seconds and 50 seconds, he was a legend. He worked alongside the Genovese family. He partnered with Meyer Lansky. He moved between the black underworld and the Italian syndicates with a fluidity that shouldn't have been possible in segregated America. But it was possible because the deal he'd helped broker decades earlier had created space for men like him to exist. He wasn't the only one. Frank Matthews, Nicky Barnes, Leroy, Nicky Barnes, a generation of black gangsters who built empires not by challenging the Italian mobs, but by operating alongside them. They paid tribute when necessary. They respected boundaries, and in return, they were allowed to build something that lasted. But here's the part that gets overlooked. The deal didn't just benefit gangsters, it shaped entire communities. Because when violence decreased, neighborhoods stabilized. When black operators controlled their own territories, money stayed local. It funded businesses, it supported families. It created jobs, illegal jobs, yes, but jobs nonetheless. The numbers racket employed thousands of people across black America. Runners, collectors, bookkeepers, and while the work was criminal, the income was real. This isn't a defense of organized crime. It's a recognition of reality. In a country that systematically denied black Americans access to legitimate wealth, the underworld became one of the few places where financial power was possible. And the 1928 deal ensured that power wasn't immediately seized by outsiders. Yet historians missed it, or ignored it, or didn't know where to look. Part of the problem was sources. Organized crime doesn't keep official records. The deals that mattered most were never written down. They were handshake agreements, enforced through reputation and fear. And when the participants died, the knowledge died with them. But there's another reason the story got buried. It didn't fit the narrative. American history is told in binaries: black versus white, oppressed versus oppressor, victim versus villain. The idea that black gangsters and white mobsters could cooperate, could negotiate, could build something together, even if that something was criminal, complicated the story. It suggested agency where there was supposed to be only subjugation. It revealed pragmatism where there was supposed to be only resistance. So, the story faded. Not because it was disproven, because it was inconvenient. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, collapsing from a heart attack in a Harlem restaurant. By then, he'd lived long enough to see the world change around him: the civil rights movement, the decline of the Italian mobs, the rise of new players in the drug trade. The old rules were breaking down, but the model he'd helped create, it lasted longer than anyone expected, even into the 1970 seconds and 80 seconds. Territorial understandings between black and Italian organized crime persisted in major cities. The specifics changed. The players changed, but the basic principle that cooperation could be more profitable than conflict remained. It wasn't until the federal government dismantled the five families through RICO prosecutions in the 1980 seconds and 90 seconds that the old system finally collapsed. And even then, it didn't disappear. It just evolved again. New organizations, new structures, new deals made in new shadows. The 1928 meeting at the Lexington Hotel didn't create a utopia. It created a business arrangement. But that arrangement proved something important. Power doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes it's loud and violent. Sometimes it's quiet and calculated. And sometimes, the most important moments in history are the ones that never made the headlines. Capone and Bumpy didn't change the world, but they changed their world. And in doing so, they left a legacy that most people don't even know exists. November 17th, 1928. A morning that should have ended in bloodshed, a meeting that shouldn't have happened, a handshake that changed everything. When Bumpy Johnson walked out of the Lexington Hotel that day, he carried more than just an agreement. He carried proof that the rules everyone believed were absolute weren't. That power could be negotiated, not just seized. That survival sometimes required breaking every social convention and betting everything on a conversation. For nearly 40 years, that deal governed the underworld in ways most people never saw. It prevented wars. It created stability. It allowed black organized crime to exist on its own terms in a country that denied black Americans almost everything else. And it did all of this in complete silence. No press conferences, no contracts, no public acknowledgement, just two men who understood that sometimes the smartest move is the one nobody sees coming. History loves its heroes and villains. It loves clear narratives and simple lessons. But the story of Capone and Bumpy doesn't fit neatly into either category. It's not a tale of good versus evil. It's a story about pragmatism, survival, and the uncomfortable truth that power operates by its own logic, one that doesn't care about the rules society pretends to follow. The deal stayed buried for decades because both sides benefited from the silence. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. The most effective power moves aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet ones. The ones that happen behind closed doors, between people who understand that reputation matters more than recognition. Bumpy Johnson and Al Capone were criminals. Let's not romanticize that. But they were also strategists who saw an opportunity where others saw only conflict. They built something that lasted longer than either of them, and they did it by understanding a truth that still applies today. Sometimes, the only way to win is to rewrite the rules entirely. That morning in Chicago, the one that started with a black man walking into a white mob boss's fortress ended with a handshake that history forgot. But forgetting something doesn't make it less real. It just makes it more dangerous, because the lessons we don't learn are the ones we're doomed to repeat. Before you go, if this story opened your eyes to something you didn't know, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Smash the like. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment telling me what you think. Was this a brilliant business move or a deal with the devil? I want to know where you stand. This is Bumpy Flame YT. We tell the stories history tried to bury, and trust me, we're just getting started.